George Monbiot is one of the world's most influential, original, and courageous environmental journalists. A regular columnist with the British newspaper The Guardian, and a regular presenter of documentaries on the BBC, he's the author of 7 books. He lists among his targets undemocratic power, corruption, deception of the public, environmental destruction, injustice, inequality, and complacency. He's reported from social and environmental hotspots all over the world, confronting Indonesian soldiers and Amazonian poachers. He's helped to establish a movement that aims to arrest former British Prime Minister Tony Blair for crimes against peace. He's won the United Nations Global 500 Award for Outstanding Environmental Achievement. I greatly admire his 2006 book, Heat: How to Stop the Planet from Burning, which he describes as a thought experiment designed to see whether Britain could achieve a 90% reduction in carbon emissions without economic or social catastrophe. To test, in other words, whether his own ideas are nonsense. He has the courage to change his mind when he thinks the evidence has changed, and that's a form of courage that very few of us can claim.
I'm driven by a strong sense of injustice, a strong sense that time is running out, that we live on a wonderful, precious, unique and beautiful planet, full of wonders of all kinds, and we are trashing it without hardly any cognizance of the damage that we're doing. And I just can't stand by and watch that process take place without doing everything I can to try to stop it. And of course, at the same time as we're trashing the natural wonders of the world, we're destroying the lives of countless people now and in the future. We're allowing governments and corporations to do enormous damage to people's lives and to their livelihoods. And you simply cannot stand by and let that happen without doing what you can. If you've got any sense of empathy, any human values, you can't just watch that process take place. And I'm in a privileged position. I'm a middle-class Westerner with a good education, with a lot of confidence, with media skills. Not to use all that when we're in this period of extraordinary global crisis, not to use it to stand up and to speak out about these things would be a profound moral dereliction.
I agree with you. But of course, traditionally, as a journalist, you're supposed to be objective, right? You're not supposed to be taking sides. But you do this routinely. I mean, you study something, you arrive at conclusions, you're not shy about expressing them.
I think you can draw a distinction between objectivity and impartiality. I'm not impartial, I'm partial. I'm very partial to protecting the environment. I'm very partial to human rights. I'm very partial to social justice. But in trying to determine what needs to be done and in trying to analyse where the problems are coming from, I try to be as objective as possible. I try to sift the facts, to go to the source of the information all the time, to look for countervailing sources of information, to try to work out who's speaking rubbish, who's providing straight facts, and to try to work out whether I'm on the right side of the issue or not, and if I'm on the wrong side of the issue, to switch over. Apart from anything else, I don't want to waste my life. Time is very short. Time is very precious. Individually, we all got limited lives, but for the planet as well, time is very short. And if we waste our lives not being properly apprised of the facts before campaigning, we spend our time chasing unicorns. We can't afford to do that. We have to be rigorous in our investigation of the facts so that we know we're campaigning on the right things. Otherwise, we fritter away this precious time that we've got.
I see that very dramatically in Heat, which I want to talk about a fair bit. But throughout that book, you're constantly going back to original sources, you're constantly going back to scientific studies and so on and so forth. I mean, you're documenting kind of sentence by sentence throughout the book.
It's the only way to go, because there is so much rubbish out there. I mean, people either unwittingly or deliberately misrepresent sources. and misinterpret sources. And unless you go to the original source, the original scientific paper, the original government report, whatever it might be, the original raw data if you can get hold of it, unless you go to that and read it yourself, you'll always have some sort of misapprehension of it. It won't be completely accurate what you're going to say.
Now, you described heat as a thought experiment, and I think it was well. Tell me what that meant, and what the experiment was for those viewers who have not read the book.
Yeah. Well, the thought experiment was to take a large post-industrial economy, namely the United Kingdom, as my experimental model, and to see whether we could engineer a 90% cut in greenhouse gas emissions without turning us into a third world country. That was the challenge which was effectively set to me at the beginning of the exercise, when I was asked at a public meeting what this country would look like if we did introduce that massive cut in greenhouse gases that I was calling for. And at that time, which was several years ago, I hadn't really thought about it. But sitting in the front row, there was a great climate expert, Mayor Hillman, and I said, well, that's such an easy question, I'll give it to Mayor to answer. And he stood up and said, a very poor third world country. And I thought, well, we can't campaign on that basis. We're not going to win on that basis. If we tell people you've got to give up everything, just about everything that you've become used to, in order to cut greenhouse gas emissions, they're not going to buy into that program. It's just not going to happen. So the challenge I set myself was to say, how are we going to engineer this massive cut, a 90% cut, which is required in the rich nations if we'd have any hope of staying within 2 degrees of global warming? How are we going to do that without causing that massive destruction of living standards, which means that people won't go with you in pursuing that program? So that was the thing I set out to do with heat. And I think sector by sector I took it, I think I more or less got there. I think I was able to show that yes, we can do it through sort of clever and subtle means of demand reduction and substituting our sources of energy. It takes political will, it takes some courage to do it, but economically, politically, socially, we can do it and we can afford to do it.
It's quite striking as you go through the book that you do go sector by sector. You say, well, what about housing? What about heating? What about transportation? And you have actually a very funny passage about what it's like to take a coach from Oxford to Cambridge. I was reading that out to my colleagues this morning. And you do get there, although the one place I think that you find that you do stub your toe is aviation.
Yeah. I mean, the problem with aviation is that there are no easy substitutes. The technological substitutes, most of them are actually worse in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, apart from airships. But airships are very slow, and most people, I don't think, would be prepared to travel by them for long distance transport. And so my conclusions were, we just got to fly a lot less than we do. And you know, that, as you say, I stubbed my toes in it. It's a good way of putting it, because you know, I found myself stumbling against this great technological block, that this ability to move over great distances very quickly indeed is something almost unique to the modern jetliner. And it's that there isn't anything, even in terms of different flying technologies, which either radically reduce that or do so without causing all sorts of other havoc. And indeed, things like the hydrogen plane turn out to be far more damaging in terms of total greenhouse gas emissions than the ordinary kerosene-powered jetliner. So that's one of those cases, and the most extreme case by a long way, where there is simply no substitute for doing less of it. And fortunately, you know, jet travel is in most cases a luxury. Most uses of jet travel aren't actually necessary. And I've managed to cut my flying right down. And I think most people can do the same, but it does take a bit of an effort of will.
It does, and I'm aware that's part of the reason we haven't been able to see each other, because when we were doing these kinds of things, we've also been trying to group To make one trip serve many purposes and not to go unless you have several purposes, which is not perfect, but some improvement anyway.
Yeah.
But the response to heat, it seems to me it's caused a lot of talk and a lot of concern, and I think you're right. I think you did show that it's possible, maybe not to 90%, but you could make a huge reduction in greenhouse gases. But nothing happened, right?
Yeah.
And if anything, we went backward.
You know, nothing happened is a pretty fair summary of the past 20 years of policy on environment, not just on climate change, but right across the environmental spectrum. Nothing happened. And this was all consolidated at the 2012 Earth Summit in Rio, where absolutely nothing happened. They produced a document which was supposed to be their plan, their way forward of the governments of the world, what they were going to do about all the environmental crises we were facing, and there was nothing in it whatsoever. There wasn't a single firm target, there wasn't a single mandatory goal. They committed to absolutely zero. And they've given up on it. They simply, the governments of the world at the moment are entirely incapable of rising to this challenge. And it's not just this challenge. They've effectively become incapable of government. What they're there for, it seems now, is to manage the transition to a fully corporate economy and a fully corporate political system. And they act on behalf of big corporations and the individuals with an awful lot of money. And their aim seems to be effectively to engineer a transition from democracy to plutocracy. To governance by money and by the moneyed classes, and anything which gets in the way of that scheme is not that they necessarily oppose it, they just don't even see it. They won't even recognise that they have a role in governance in doing something other than managing that transition. And so the idea of going to them and saying, look, you are the only people who are capable, because you've got that global reach, you've got the national reach within your own territories. As a collection of governments, you've got that global reach. You're the only people capable of regulating. You're the only people who can step in and actually change the policies which are driving climate change. They look at you as if you're talking another language.
And there's also a kind of suicidal character to all of this too, because the plutocracy is not going to survive a fried planet either, right?
Well, ultimately, none of us. I mean, if it gets to a certain point, beyond a certain point, and some of the predictions which are now being made by climate scientists are going way beyond those that were being made 10 years ago, as we see climate change accelerating beyond even the worst anticipated scenarios. Particularly with the Arctic ice melt, with some of the extreme weather patterns we've been having, especially in the northern hemisphere. For the time being, most people will get by, but gradually life becomes harder and harder for an increasing proportion of the population. Paradoxically, of course, the people driving the problem more than any others, the executive class, the plutocratic class, they are the last to get hit, because they can always buy their way out of trouble. They can move. They've got the money to insulate themselves to a far greater degree than anyone else. But eventually, it's going to affect them in one way or another.
And somehow they must be finding ways to ignore that, not to understand that.
Finding ways to ignore things, finding ways to deny things is a very powerful human characteristic. And I think it goes far beyond climate change or any of the other immediate crises we face. I think it's a survival mechanism. I think it's a way in which humans negotiate their unique awareness of death. No other species, as far as we know, knows that it's going to die, knows that the present moment cannot be repeated indefinitely into the future, that eventually your life is going to come to an end. And our ability to see into the future, to see patterns in events and to picture ourselves in those changing patterns, to see that life is going to alter in one way or another, that's been absolutely critical to human success. to our ability to colonize lots of different habitats, to store food in anticipation of the changing seasons, to be such effective hunters and then such effective farmers and industrialists and all the rest of it. All that comes from our ability to imagine ourselves into the future. But one of the consequences of that remarkable imagination that we possess is that we can imagine our own deaths. Now, if we were not able to put that out of our minds, to blot out that uncomfortable truth, and to effectively, on the day-to-day level, deny that we are mortal, we would just deliquesce into a heap in the corner of the room and sit there rocking with our hands over our heads, because you can't face that knowledge of mortality head on. You can't every day wake up knowing I'm a day closer to my death and continue to function. If you're going to survive and function and be effective in life, you have to blot the fact of your death out of your mind. And that survival mechanism has also become a counter-adaptive mechanism, a mechanism which damages our survival, because that ability to deny, that ability to block out what we don't want to see, ensures that we also don't want to see a lot of other things which are a bit like death. Climate change is a bit like death. I mean, it can cause death, of course, but it's also, it's a death of all sorts of things that we hold precious. It's something which takes place over a long period, and that the way you live now contributes to the likelihood of that death arriving in 20, 30 years' time. There are quite a few similarities between climate change and death, the knowledge of climate change and the knowledge of death. And so that survival mechanism, which allows us not to have our own deaths at the forefront of our consciousness all the time, operates to shut out issues such as climate change just the same way.
And we've invented a device called a corporation that doesn't die. Right? And that's what's really running this whole disastrous scenario, right?
Yes, and the problem with the corporation is that they have a duty to maximize the revenue to their shareholders. That's their bottom line. That's what they're there for. And if the directors neglect that duty, they can be prosecuted. And there is no other bottom line, apart from continually raising the salaries of the executives. That also seems to be a new objective, which perhaps has become more powerful than the original one. But neither of those objectives do anything to moderate the impact that those corporations have on people and on the planet. That their purpose is not to look after the biosphere, their purpose is not to look after human beings, their purpose is to maximize their revenues. And that purpose occasionally can be aligned with the good of certain planetary boundaries and planetary benefits. So, for instance, if someone is putting out a technology which substitutes for fossil fuels, then the success of that corporation can fit in with your aims on climate change. But the majority of the corporate economy does not work that way. Most of it is about using more resources, increasing productivity, and as a result putting greater strain upon the world's natural systems. And that process cannot continue indefinitely. You cannot have infinite growth on a finite planet.
And there's a sort of radical simplification of human life and of one's apprehension of the world if you look at it through a corporate lens, right? In just the same way that you reduce, as a corporation, biodiversity by cutting down the rainforest, you also reduce human diversity, intellectual diversity. It's just this, you become this very simple thing.
Well, this ethos has seeped into every aspect of our lives now. We're told the market will decide. You don't have to worry about making decisions. We don't have to bother with democracy and all these sort of messy things like this. The market can work things out. If people decide that this is what they want to buy, then that's the decision the market makes, and it'll be for the greatest good of the greatest number, because the invisible hand will magically guide our decisions in the right direction. Now, as soon as the market comes into conflict with environmental values, you just find that it doesn't work at all in that way. Far from it, that what it drives is a relentless expansion into the natural world and across the planetary boundaries, destroying resources as it goes. And that what drives the market, which is primarily the interests of the richest people who have the most market power, of course, is profoundly undemocratic. You know, some people have millions of votes and other people have no votes whatsoever, if you consider the market to be a form of government. Their desires are often wildly at odds with the desires of the world's poorer people, and yet they have the market power and they drive the market system towards their interests, which are often diametrically opposed to those of the poor of the world. And so what we see happening as governments succumb to this idea that they need not govern anymore, the market can sort it all out, it is not a shrinking of the state, which is what the neoliberal theorists keep telling us is what they're aiming for. It's a shrinking of democracy. It's a straightforward assault on democracy. It's a substitution of voting power, of electoral power, with money power. And that's a very bad thing for everyone, except for the millionaires and the billionaires.
Which is actually what you described that in Heat as the problem with split incentives, that the people who are going to suffer the most are...
Yeah. Yes, I have to say that since then, that picture has begun to change somewhat, because it seemed fairly clear at the time that I wrote Heat that it's going to be the poor of the world who would suffer first and worst from climate change, and the rich people would suffer last and least. And so that's where the split incentive came in, that the people who are doing most to drive climate change, because they're consuming most fossil fuels, who are the richest people on Earth, would be the last people to be hit by it. Whereas the poorest people living in the marginal habitats, already stressed climatically in a lot of the places where they live, not enough rainfall, too much rainfall, pushed against the coastline, in vulnerable mountain habitats, all of these places where a lot of poor people live and are very, very vulnerable to climate change, they'd be the people who'd be hit first and worst. But what we have seen as a result of some pretty extreme changes in the Northern Hemisphere is that actually a lot of the richest countries are now being hit very hard already by climate change. And there's a lot of data coming out to show that the extreme weather events are now part of a pattern, that some parts of the Northern Hemisphere have been getting an unbelievable amount of rainfall, and the UK is one of those nations where we've just been getting staggering levels of rainfall and snowfall in the winter, whereas other places have been hit by very powerful heat waves and droughts, and large sections of North America fall into that category. And what seems to be driving this is the rapid melting in the Arctic and the rapid heating in the Arctic, which has changed the speed and the depth of the meanders in the jet stream. Now, the jet stream is effectively the boundary between cold, wet weather to the north and warm, dry weather to the south. It's a sort of ribbon which forms a boundary between those two climate regimes. And it has these big waves, these big meanders, as it travels westwards around the planet. And what the Arctic heating seems to have done is to slow down those waves and to make them much steeper. And so the weather system stalls effectively, it gets stuck, the weather gets stuck. And so you'll be stuck, as we have been this last summer in the UK, with extraordinary rainfall, just, where we had weeks and weeks on end of rain, with flooding and terrible impacts and massive crop failures, particularly for fruit, for instance, where none of the pollinators came out because it was just too wet and cold. And we had a really miserable first half of the summer. It was just horrible and extreme, and people died in floods, and a lot of people had their houses flooded. And then at exactly the same time, on the other side of the meander, the weather got stuck in North America with no rain at all, because it was to the south side of a great meander in the jet stream. And the temperature just escalated and escalated, and it now seems that extreme weather is another way of saying stuck weather. It's instead of these sort of benign transitions, sunshine and showers, as you get a little bit of this, a little bit of that, as the weather systems pass over. If the meanders in the jet stream get stuck, the weather gets stuck, and you just get the same thing day after day after day, and that builds up. The temperature gets higher and higher, the drought gets worse and worse, or the hills get more and more saturated as you get more and more rain. It keeps raining, you get floods. And all this is happening right now in the northern nations. And so it begins to look as if, the rich countries are going to be hit as hard by climate change and as soon by climate change, it's already happening, as the poor nations.
But it's not perceived that way, is it? It's perceived as an eccentricity in the weather system, not as a pattern, right? Because if it were perceived as a pattern, perhaps we would start to think about some of the changes that we need to make.
Well, within the scientific literature now, there have been several prominent papers published showing the pattern is now well established, that we're looking at a far greater frequency of extreme events than we saw in the past. But in the popular perception, you're quite right. It's like, oh, the weather's always changed, there have always been records set in one place or another. But it's the number of records, the frequency with which those are being set, the number of extreme events, the number of droughts and floods and storms, that has changed. It's changed profoundly.
Now, do you foresee a political implication coming out of all of this? Political consequences coming from these changes?
That's what logic would dictate. Logic would dictate that the politicians would stand up and say, "Oh, something needs to be done here." We're seeing seriously threatening changes taking place. We're all dependent for our survival upon the climate. Ultimately, you can't grow crops if the climate's wrong. You can't live in certain places if the climate's wrong. So you'd think that would be what they'd prioritise. Far from it. The more extreme the situation becomes, the further they retreat into denial and inaction. I don't know if you saw Mitt Romney's speech to the Republican convention in Florida this year. It was quite extraordinary. It took place in the week during which the Arctic minimum ice record was broken, and not just broken by a little bit, but broken spectacularly, 3 weeks ahead of the likely minimum that already broke the 2007 record, which was just shocking and frightening, or it should have been. The convention came at the same time as Hurricane Isaac was sweeping across. It just missed Florida, just missed Tampa where the convention was, but it was sweeping into Louisiana, and the Republican convention had actually been cut short by a day because of the likelihood of being hit by Hurricane Isaac. Did this have the slightest impact on Romney? Nothing whatsoever. Far from it. He stands up and he mocks the idea that governments should take action on climate change. He mocks the idea that Obama aimed to try to do something about the fact that sea levels are rising and the rest of it. It was for him a big joke. And he made this statement about the president wants to try to stop the sea levels rising. Long pause, and he just let the laughter build up and build up across the convention centre until people were jeering and hooting at this ridiculous idea that you should try to do anything about climate change. He wants to try to save the planet. Another long pause, and people, he lets the laughter build up. And this is an object of mockery, that governments should actually try to act. The most powerful government in the world should try to act against the most pressing threat that humanity faces with something to laugh at.
Now, how do you carry off that level of denial?
Well, you have to be surrounded by a lot of people who are in the same place as you. Yeah, you have to. It's the cheers and boos of the home crowd is what you're playing to, and if the home crowd is with you, then you can go anywhere you want. I mean, this is how all crazy political movements go, because you just supported, if you got the support of the people around you, and you're not hearing the other story for a start, you're just hearing your sentiments echoed back to you by the people who are around you, and their sentiments are being echoed back to them from you, and you end up in this closed circle of this sort of self-reinforcing narrative, which doesn't have any effective challenge to it. And all extreme movements that's how they evolve. And what we're seeing now in the United States in particular is an extreme movement developing which has a fair chance of seizing the presidency. And it's a movement opposed to any government intervention at all, except for intervention for the benefit of the richest people and the richest corporations. They're quite happy to sustain subsidies for fossil fuel extraction. They're quite happy to sustain these massive bank bailouts and the rest of it, but they're not happy to sustain welfare payments to the poorest people on earth, and then, or the poorest people in the nation rather. They're not happy to sustain any policies which avert great threats like climate change.
You know, as you say that, it connects to a theme that we've been seeing in Canada. I know you're more conscious of the Canadian situation than a lot of people in this country might be, but one of the themes that's come out of this majority conservative government in Canada is something that we've been calling the death of evidence, that the government is basing its decisions, it's closing down all the sources of information,
yes.
all the research, all the science and so on, that would threaten its ideological worldview.
Yes, I saw a few very powerful articles about how you've got a government which is deeply hostile to hearing the scientific evidence, and as you say, is shutting it down. It's an extraordinary thing to witness from this side of the Atlantic, to watch Canada, this highly sophisticated, liberal, outward-looking nation, turning into a thuggish petrostate. To see it succumbing to the resource curse in the same way as Nigeria or Saudi Arabia or anywhere else, where you basically have a group of oligarchs who control the fossil fuel revenues and end up controlling the political system. Normally countries go through a transition the other way. They start off with primary production, with mineral extraction, agriculture. They move to secondary production and industry. They then move to tertiary production, going more into the knowledge economy, service economy and the rest of it. Canada very rapidly is going the opposite way down that slope. It's going from being a very sophisticated tertiary economy back to being a primary producer of the dirtiest mineral of all, which is tar sands. I mean, it's just with horrendous environmental consequences, and that is changing the entire nature of that nation. It's changing its political character in deeply frightening ways, and it's turning into a giant Texas or a giant Alabama. It's really scary to see how, in some ways, Harper has taken it to a far more extreme level of neoconservatism and neoliberalism even than George Bush contemplated.
Mm-hmm. Andy Nikiforuk argues that the resource curse means that if you have a real dominance of the oil industry in the country, it will evoke this kind of politics that oil demands oligarchy. Right?
Yeah. Yes, it's. I mean, one of the things to recognise about all mineral extraction is that it's effectively it depends upon a licence by government for a private corporation, or in some cases a state corporation, to use a public resource. The public resource is what lies under the ground, which belongs to everyone and no one. It's part of our common heritage. It's part of the constituency, the geological constituency of the earth. And in order to turn that into an extractable resource, the government must license someone, either a state company or a private company, to say, you may extract this resource, and you may do so at a certain cost. You pay us a certain royalty, which should reflect the price of that resource, but it never does. And every mineral deal you ever look into, if there's a private operator involved, they've been given that resource or sold that resource at way below its market value. And people become astonishingly rich through the production of minerals, whether it's petroleum or whether it's any kind of metal or any other mineral that they're extracting. They become astonishingly rich because they are effectively given it. They're given a large section of that resource by the government because they're not paying what it's worth. And so the number of oil and mining billionaires around the world, you know, if you look at the Forbes list of billionaires, it's stuffed with mining and oil interests. And that's because of cronyism, effectively. They are the favoured recipients of this very generous deal which the government is giving them on behalf of the people. So basically the entire nation is giving them something which belongs to that nation and saying, here, you can have half or 3/4 of its value or 90% of its value. We're just going to give that away to you. Now, in order for that to happen, those people have to be in with the governing class. They have to be sort of part of that nexus of state industrial power. They have to have done political favours to that governing class. So it's a corrupt and corrupting process. The issuance of minerals extraction licences and the setting of royalties is always attended by corruption. Whichever country you go to, it is attended by corruption. And that eventually corrupts the entire body politic.
It's really an extension of the Corn Laws and the Enclosure Acts, right? It's the appropriation of the commons for the private benefit of the small class.
It's a bit like the establishment of royal monopolies under the Stuart kings in this country in the 17th century, where you say, right, this guild or this person and this guild or person alone will be able to exploit this particular kind of trade. And in this case, you're saying, you, our favoured oligarch, are going to be given this massive state resource which you can exploit on this particular patch. And on this particular patch, that now belongs to you, it doesn't belong to us anymore. And so it is giving away a public resource to a private interest at knockdown rates.
And we see this also with the fishery, with forestry, with the appropriation of pieces of the ocean for aquaculture. We've just done a big project on aquaculture, Chris and I. Now how do you stop that? What do you do about this? Because this process seems, beyond a certain point, almost unstoppable.
Well, nothing is unstoppable in politics, but it can be very, very hard to stop certain processes.
I did say almost.
Yes, yes. And I mean, you're right. Once it's set in train, it's very hard to interrupt that process, because these people acquire, the more money they acquire, the more political power they acquire as a result of having that money, particularly in our unreformed political systems, where we just have not dealt almost anywhere with campaign financing, where people can effectively buy government policy. You know, if you need to raise millions of dollars for your political campaign, you're going to go to the rich people who've got those millions of dollars. And so the rich people end up holding the purse strings and determining what your policy is going to be. Because if your policy isn't what they want, then they're not going to fund you anymore. And you know that as a politician. You can't afford to alienate rich people. However obvious a call from natural justice is that you should be standing up for the poor, you end up standing up for the rich, whose interests are often diametrically opposed to those of the poor. And that's the fundamental corrupting issue which prevents governments from acting on any issue other than this transformation of our democracy into a plutocracy. And so fundamentally, if we're going to deal with the environmental crisis, it's the same as dealing with the crisis of inequality and the crisis of social immobility and the crisis of the maldistribution of wealth in the world. You have to deal with campaign finance.
And you know, Canada had actually started to do that. And that's one of the things that Harper very quickly rolled back. He almost lost his minority government over the issue, but once he had a majority, there was no stopping him.
And that locks it in, doesn't it? Once you've sorted that out, then the government which is closest to the billionaires is the one which stays in power.
Yeah. You've changed your mind about a couple of major issues since heat. Nuclear power, peak oil. Tell me about those changes.
Yeah. Well, with nuclear power, it's not that I like the technology any more than I did.
All the people.
Yeah. Well, all the people, you know. I mean, there are very few energy generating technologies I like. I think we're all the same in that respect. We all like the electricity that comes out. We don't like the way it's produced, and I don't like nuclear any more than I did. But what hit me very hard was the recognition that if we start shutting down our major source of low carbon energy, which it remains at the moment, during a climate change crisis, that's madness. Seeing what's happened in Germany is been really salutary, where they claimed that they were going to replace all their nuclear power stations with renewables. Well, maybe that's what they're doing, but they're replacing nuclear rather than replacing fossil fuels with renewables, and the result is that we're looking at 23 new coal-burning plants being constructed in Germany. You know, this was a country which was rapidly decarbonising, a country which was rapidly going green, and that one decision to shut down the nuclear industry for no good scientific reason, but out of sentiment, effectively, as a result, a wild overreaction to the disaster at Fukushima, that is sending all Germany's indicators the wrong way. It's heading back towards a fossil fuel economy. Not just any old fossil fuel. A lot of these plants will be burning lignite, brown coal, which is the most polluting. It's up there with tar sands as the worst possible fossil fuel. You know, it's just horrendous. You know, in terms of stuff you'll burn in a power station, it's the most polluting of all. And to see that happening and realise that that's as a result of green lobbying, of environmental lobbying, that we're seeing a massive increase in carbon dioxide emissions, a great increase in heavy metal pollution and all the other local pollution impacts that coal has, an increase paradoxically in the spread of radionuclides, of radioactive pollution, because coal burning produces more radioactive pollution extraordinarily than nuclear power generation does, because of the trace amounts of radionuclides in coal. To see all this resulting from environmental demands and environmental lobbying, it makes me want to despair. It's like, what do we stand for? Is this really what we're calling for? And that takes us back to where we began this interview, with the idea that you've got to be rigorous about assessing your sources of information, and you've got to be very careful not to be blinded by sentiment, and to actually weigh up the hard data on each side of the equation and say, is this real? Or is this more real? You know, who's telling the truth here? And with nuclear power, you see a large number of people on the environmental side who are engaging in exactly the kind of pseudoscience and junk science and denial which the climate change deniers engage in support of the fossil fuel industry. And by opposing nuclear, they are de facto supporting the fossil fuel industry, because that's the way in which nuclear is going to be replaced in the great majority of cases.
It takes some courage to change your mind like that, very publicly and on a large issue, and you know, for someone who's in a leadership position such as you are. What's that like as an experience?
It can be quite a bruising experience. I mean, it was a bruising experience. You know, I got a fantastic amount of hate mail as a result of that. I understand it. You know, people want to know where you stand, and they want you to stay in the same place, because it's disorienting to see someone whose views you otherwise agree with changing radically a view in a particular thing. I got a bit of support as well, but a lot more brickbats, a lot of attacks, and a couple of close friends basically decided they wouldn't be my friend anymore because of the way I changed my position on that, which was very hurtful. I found that very difficult indeed, and however much I've tried to reason with them and to say, look, actually, you know, ultimately what counts is friendship. Nope, you changed your mind in nuclear power, so we just can't associate with you anymore. And I find it extraordinary, but that's the way it's been. And you know, what I try to point out is we've all got the same aim here. You know, we're trying to protect the world's natural systems. We're trying to protect the future of humanity. We just disagree about the best means by which it should be done. We disagree about the technology. That's all it is. It's about which carbon reducing technology we go for and what's the most effective and the quickest way to get there. You know, why fall out over that? But unfortunately, that's not how human minds work, really. So yeah, it has been hard, but you know, a very striking thing is that some of the things I say, you know, I come to regret later on. I think, oh yeah, I was wrong about that. You know, quite often happens. I deal with very complex issues. I deal with quite a lot of issues, and you're bound to get stuff wrong from time to time. But reading back over what I've written about nuclear power since I changed my mind in it, I think, you know, there's nothing there that I've come to regret or to disagree with. You know, I think that the facts are so clear and so stark about what a transition away from nuclear power does in terms of all kinds of environmental impacts, not just climate change. And the way I've put it and the facts I've marshalled, none of them have been effectively knocked down. You know, what you see is an awful lot of people accusing me of saying things I didn't say, but hardly anyone even attempting to engage with the things that I did say, and to knock those arguments down, because it's very hard to knock them down.
Well, you also have not changed your mind about many aspects of nuclear power. I mean, you don't like its association with weapons. You don't like its the way that it has a sort of a similar impact to oil in terms of politics, and you know, so there's a whole bunch of stuff that you haven't changed your mind about. You've just said this is another obnoxious way of doing it, but it's the less obnoxious and less dangerous at this moment.
Yes, right? I mean, the truth is they're all obnoxious. It's all obnoxious. You know, the mass rollout of wind power, for instance, you know, which I support, but it's still obnoxious. You know, a lot of people object very strongly to it, and some of those objections are sensible objections. People don't like to see their landscapes change. I can completely understand that objection. They say a lot of rubbish at the same time. You know, there's a lot of, you know, they say that, oh, wind doesn't reduce carbon emissions and things, which is completely untrue. But you know, they've got a case when it comes to landscape, no question about it. But you know, it comes back to this point that we all like electricity and we all hate the means by which it's produced. You know, and we have to make some hard choices. You know, either we're going to do without electricity, which I don't think is going to be an option, really. You know, that's no one seriously is lobbying for that. Or we're going to have to decide how the electricity is going to be produced, and there is no perfect solution. Look at solar, for instance. You know, people would love to believe that solar is going to be the answer for all nations on Earth, because it's the least intrusive. It's got very few toxic emissions. It's you don't need massive, great power stations to produce solar electricity. You can do it on your own rooftop. People can actually make money from it, especially if there's very generous subsidies. And if you're in Southern California, for instance, solar makes a lot of sense. If you're, you know, in a place like that, peak electricity demand is in the middle of the day when everyone switches their air conditioners on, which is when you get peak electricity supply from your solar panels. A place like the UK, peak electricity demand is between 5 and 7 on a winter's evening. Now, there's a lot of argument to be had about about a whole range of facts and figures, but one thing you can't argue with is that the sun does not shine between 5 and 7 o'clock on a winter's evening in the UK. And in fact, it shines very little across the whole winter, and as we've been seeing recently, across the whole blinking summer. We're at the wrong latitude, we're in the wrong place. And solar is a great technology at lower latitudes. It really works tremendously well. At higher latitudes, it's woefully ill-matched to the pattern of demand. It's woefully ill-matched to the weather systems that we've got. And it's simply, it's a very, very expensive and wasteful way of trying to produce our electricity. There's a fascinating government figure which shows that if you were to cover every available roof and every available wall in the United Kingdom with solar panels at a cost of hundreds of billions, probably trillions of pounds. It would bankrupt the economy, basically. You would substitute 9% of the fossil fuels we use. 9. So, so it's completely daft. It is so obvious that it is not the way to go in countries like this, but it's what people desperately want to believe is right, and so they really cling on to that. Apart from that, every other form of electricity generation people really hate.
That's true. Even hydroelectricity, which has been a big clean one for.
Well, I mean, hey, look, there's often very good reasons for hating hydroelectric. You know, I mean, there's big hydroelectric dams have done horrendous damage.
Yeah. I want to take you to another one on which you've changed your mind, and that's peak oil. Tell me about peak oil. What you now feel about peak oil.
Well, I'm not so completely sure of this one, but that we have massively overstated the arrival and imminence of peak oil is very clear to me. Whether it's going to happen at all in the next 20, 30 years, that's less clear to me. I can't unequivocally say it won't, but I can unequivocally say that so far we've been wrong about it. And in fact, you know, as environmentalists, we tend to be wrong about the dates of resource depletion in general. We tend to be right about most other things, but when it comes to resource depletion, we keep calling it, and it keeps not happening. And you know, and I don't think there has been a single year in the past 15 where someone hasn't said this year oil is going to peak. And yeah, you know, the cheaper, more accessible sources of oil, those, a lot of them have been exhausted, most of them have been exhausted. Oil has become more expensive, it's become more difficult, people are going further to get it, they're using more advanced technologies to get it, they're using more dangerous techniques to get it, where they're more likely to damage vulnerable habitats and the rest. But you know, so far we have not seen a clear peak of conventional oil taking place. And you know, let alone a peak of overall liquid fuels. That is, we're nowhere near that point at the moment. And my fear is that, you know, environmentalists have used peak oil as a way of wishing the problem of climate change and destruction of the environment and the rest of it, wishing it out of existence. Peak oil is going to solve all this for us. And actually, you know, if the oil does peak, which, you know, I'm not saying it won't, if the oil does peak, then the likely response of corporations and governments will be extremely damaging. You know, they go for much even uglier technologies, more into unconventionals like your tar sands, into coal to liquids, turning coal into liquid fuels, which is incredibly damaging and destructive and polluting. You know, we've got no shortage of fossil fuels in the world, and you know, effectively any organic molecule can be turned into any other organic molecule. You know, if you want to make liquid fuels, you've got loads of potential feedstocks to do it from. And you know, whether it's bitumen or tar sands or coal or methane hydrates, or you know, there's loads of this stuff under the Earth's surface. We've got a great deal of fossil fuel in the Earth's crust, and people will find a way. They will demand a way of continuing to produce liquid fuels. And a lot of hopes have been pinned on peak oil, and a lot of crazy stuff has been written about peak oil, where you know, people sort of seemed almost to see it in the way of a millenarian cult. You know, this great thing will come down to Earth and will save us all, and will change the entire economy, and will deliver the local subsistence economy which we fantasize about. It's not going to happen like that. When it does happen, it's going to be very nasty indeed, but it's unlikely to happen nearly as soon as a lot of people have been saying.
One of the things we seem to have underestimated two things, and one of them is human ingenuity, and the other one is probably the power of the market. Because one of the things that's striking about this is that peak oil at a certain price, right? But if the price keeps going up, then dribs and drabs of oil here and there that were thought uneconomic suddenly become economic. And so there's an intimate relationship between the market and and the availability of oil.
That's right, and that's one thing that environmentalists have not been good at seeing, not been good at understanding. And the same with a whole load of other resources as well. I mean, there are loads of resources which were supposed to have run out by now. And in fact, paradoxically, the resources which have been running out are the renewable resources, not the non-renewable resources. Fish, for example, timber of certain kinds, certain species of timber in the old growth forests have gone now. You can't find them anymore; they don't exist. Other wildlife-based resources have gone, because beyond a certain point, a renewable resource becomes a non-renewable resource. But we've all been concentrating on the non-renewable resources disappearing, and have kind of taken our eye off the main picture, which is a very rapid disappearance of renewable resources.
You've been active in that front for quite some time. So given this situation, this has been, despite its pleasantness, a rather depressing conversation. What should people be doing now? What are the useful avenues for people to explore?
There are only three useful things you can do: mobilize, mobilize, and mobilize. Number one, you can't do anything by yourself. It's completely useless. You think you've got consumer power, you can buy a better brand of biscuits, that's going to save the planet. It does not work. It does not work. Consumer power can be a tool in the toolbox, but only in the context of political change. Because otherwise, all you are doing is creating more space for other people to move into. So you say, right, I'm not going to drive a car, I'm going to ride a bike, which is a very good thing to do. I'm not in any way arguing against that. You should be switching from your car to your bicycle. That's a very positive thing to do. But unless it takes place in the context of political change, unless the government is simultaneously switching road space away from cars and towards bicycles, all you do is free up some more road space for someone else to drive a more polluting car than you would have driven. Because, as we've known since the first paper was published on this in 1938, that traffic expands to fill the available road space. It's an iron law of transport planning. And so if you get rid of your little hatchback and replace it with a bicycle, someone's going to move in with an SUV, with a sports utility vehicle which you wouldn't have driven, into that space that you were previously using. And so you've got to have that political change, and political change only comes about as a result of mobilization. Now, this mobilization becomes harder and harder as life goes on for various reasons. One, because of the switch that's been taking place from democracy to plutocracy, where governments are less and less amenable to what the public is saying. They're just not listening to the extent that they listened in the past. Secondly, because of a sense of defeatism, which seems to have caught so many people up, which is partly the result of recognizing that governments aren't responding, but partly the result of other factors as well. That there has not, that with the death of the industrial working class, there simply isn't the social context within which mass organisation took place before, and so it's much harder then to mobilise. You don't have this ready-made political base where everybody was doing more or less the same job within that base. Everybody, within industries, you're doing more or less the same job. You have more or less the same class interests. You're all fighting for exactly the same thing. That was a very powerful base to organise from politically, and that has gone. We have now a fragmented workforce. We have outsourcing. We have very small industrial workforces in the rich nations, and we have a multiplicity of actors prevailing upon them, and so their interests don't naturally coalesce in the same way. We also find that if people have got enough bread and enough circuses, they're very reluctant to mobilise, and the circuses are particularly good at the moment. We've got wall-to-wall 24-hour entertainment of every single kind you could wish for. We have incredible sports coverage, we have wonderful movies, we have fantastic animation, we have the internet and all the wonders of the internet. You can find anything you want to watch on YouTube. You've got everything there in front of you, and that is literally mind-numbing. It numbs you. It makes you more sedentary. It makes you less inclined to get out into the real world, to mobilize, to walk the streets. And that very, very effective and brilliant entertainment system we have, unwittingly in most cases, becomes a means of demobilizing us. So mobilization is harder than it was before, but it's no less necessary. It's even more necessary than it was. And somehow we got to find the means of shaking ourselves down and getting out there and mobilizing.
And not easy given the state of the media. The media, which has also become very much part of the entertainment system.
The media is a huge part of the problem. Yeah. To own a major media company, you need to be a billionaire. And what billionaires want is generally the polar opposite of what the rest of the population wants and needs. You know, they want a better world for billionaires. Everyone wants a better world for people like themselves, but a better world for billionaires tends to be a much worse world for everybody else. It has great inequality, it has very little political challenge to the people at the top, it has very little social mobility, because billionaires don't want a world where they could cease to be billionaires, they want to stay in that place, and it has massive resource use and exploitation by the richest people, which then shuts those resources off or makes them more expensive for everybody else. It's a world dominated by billionaires is a very bad world on the whole for everybody else. And so the billionaires who own the media, their role is to persuade people that a world that's good for billionaires is a world that's good for everyone. And so in other words, to tell the opposite of the truth, in effect. And they do that very effectively. You know, there's a lot of thought goes into how to spin stuff in the media, and they will appoint editors in their own image, and the editors will then appoint journalists in their own image, and you'll get people who instinctively know what is required of them, what they have to say to keep their jobs and to advance within the organisation, what they have to say to win prizes given to them by other like-minded journalists. And it's a deeply corrupt industry, and it's one whose primary purpose has become to support and project power. To me, the primary purpose of journalism should be to challenge power. It's to hold power to account. That's what journalism should be for. But the way it's evolved is it does exactly the opposite thing.
And you have the good fortune of having found some slots in which you can still practice the kind of journalism that we agree needs to be practiced. Am I right in thinking that journalism for you, and I'm going back to George as a person, not so much as a public figure, but for you, it strikes me as though journalism has provided you with a way of having a continuing education for a mind that would not be satisfied to stop being educated. Is that a fair statement?
That's absolutely right, and I feel incredibly lucky that basically I can make my living doing what I would have wanted to do anyway, even if I wasn't being paid for it, which is just constant exploration and investigation and learning, and it's a wonderful thing. I can say to my editors, and I'm in a very lucky position at The Guardian, where I'm a columnist, I can say, this week I want to write about such and such a subject, you know, and I might know a little bit about the subject, but before I write about it, I'm going to have to know a heck of a lot more about that subject. And then I have a few days to just sit down and read and talk to people, but especially to read and to sort of chase out the sources, to dig out scientific papers, whatever it may be. And that process of investigation and discovery, I love it. It's wonderful, and can be pretty terrifying as well. But it's absolutely fascinating, and I feel that, you know, my schooling continues every day. And I've got a very hungry mind. I've got a very curious mind. I always want to know more about what's going on in the world, and this allows me not to satisfy that hunger, but at least to appease it.
You strike me as a prime example of something that's, I think, very little recognized, which is that learning requires courage. You know, you cannot do it unless you're willing to be put in you've often been in physically difficult situations, but also in intellectually difficult situations, embarrassments like having to change your mind on things because you learned some more about it. And all that. Yeah. It also strikes me that some of what you're discovering is about George Monbiot. That I thought one of the most striking and deeply honest pieces of heat was your little discussion of being in the Wild West atmosphere of the garimpos in Brazil, and discovering that in the middle of something of a whole context, all of which appalled you, you loved it.
Yes, yes, that's right. Yeah, well, that's right, and you have to recognise that, you know, within all of us are all the weaknesses that any human being ever has. You know, and some of us have those weaknesses in greater degree, and some in lesser degree. But the temptations, the weaknesses, they're there in all of us, and discovering and negotiating those is part of the process of being human, and recognizing your own forms of denial and your own ability not to see what you don't want to see, and to see things in a certain way, and to recognize that you can be addicted to a particular kind of bullshit, and you have to try to break that addiction. You know, all that is part of the process of growth and development, and it's one which should not stop at childhood. It should continue throughout your lives, right through to the very end of your life. And it's been a fascinating journey for me, you know, and it's a journey which will keep going on, and I do discover more about who I am and who I can be through this process, and it's not always a pleasant discovery. You know, I don't always like what I see, but you know, what did Socrates say? The unexamined life is not worth living. Yeah. And the thoroughly examined life, you know, which includes psychotherapy and things. I think psychotherapy is incredibly important. I think everyone should have it. You know, just because of what you discover about yourself, it's a wonderful, life-affirming, life-enriching thing, and you know, there's a lot of very sophisticated psychotherapy out there at the moment which tells you about yourself and tells you why you get irrational about certain things, and why you might fly off the handle about something which really you shouldn't, you know, because you begin sort of taking about, oh, really, I'm responding to something that happened in my childhood. You know, you get to know yourself much better. Now that's what enriches and enlightens your life, alongside your own discoveries, which can be discoveries you make through sort of academic pursuits, and through socializing, through talking to people, through being challenged. That's what makes life good. And you know, people, you know, there's a big tendency to run away from that, and to fear it, to think that's going to restrict and diminish your life, and clamp you down because of all those anxieties which it'll reveal. It releases you from a lot of anxiety. It allows you to spread your wings a lot, and to really get to know yourself better. And as you get to know things better, whatever it is, you know, whether it's yourself or whether it's the political situation you're in, then you can cope with it better. You know, the biggest fears I have are for things I don't understand very well. And as I get to understand them more, I can see where the chinks of light are. I can see where hope might lie. And then, you know, I still recognize the severity and the importance of the problem, but I don't see it as this monolithic terror where there's no room for attacking and changing it.
And that's where the courage comes in. You have to come close enough up to it to actually see it.
Yeah. And then, having done so, you know, you perhaps need slightly less courage than you did before, because you've faced that worst fear, and you find that it's not quite as bad as you thought it was. There is a way forward, and then that emboldens you. You become braver as a result of facing it.
It occurs to me that that's a wonderful note to end on, because what, in a sense, we've been talking about all the way through here is a very frightening situation that requires a lot of courage from a lot of people. And I think courage is something that can be built by examples, but also by the kind of understanding that we've just been describing.
Yeah. The one thing I fear is other people's cowardice. You can deal with your own cowardice. You can confront it and address your own cowardice. You can't confront and address other people's cowardice. They run away from your attempts to do so, and you know, that's what will sink us. Will be cowardice. You know, is people just not prepared to take on the powers, not prepared to challenge money and power, and to fight for a better world. And it's not so much, you know, people's acquiescence in the system, but their failure to challenge it that will drag us down. And that failure becomes more and more evident as we demobilize.
The restless and brilliant George Monbiot, investigative journalist, distinguished author, and environmental campaigner. If you enjoyed this conversation, you may also enjoy our green interviews with the legendary author Farley Mowat and with poet and small farmer Brian Brett. For the Green Interview, I'm Silver Donald Cameron. Thanks for watching.